What if Issei was betrayed by Rias and abandoned by Ddraig? The rain started around 9. Issei had noticed it the way he noticed most things lately, distantly, as a fact rather than a feeling. Water on glass. Sound on silence. He was sitting on the floor of the Occult Research Club's basement storage room, back against the shelf of dusty grimoires, knees pulled up, listening to the muffled sound of voices upstairs filtering through the old floorboards. He hadn't meant to be down here. He'd come to return a book Aquino had lent him 3 weeks ago, the kind of polite errand that still mattered to him even now, even when everything else was starting to feel like it was built on sand. He'd heard the voices when he reached the top of the basement stairs and stopped, hand on the door, because something in the tone was wrong, wrong like a note played slightly flat. Wrong enough that you couldn't stop listening. Rias's voice, calm and measured. Then a voice he didn't recognize, male, older, the careful pronunciation of someone who considered every word a tool. He'd heard that kind of voice in rating game negotiations, in the formal chambers of devil politics where everything meant 3 things at once. He'd stood there for 4 minutes before he understood what he was hearing. By the time the voices stopped and footsteps moved toward the exit on the far side of the building, Issei was sitting on the basement floor with the borrowed book still in his hands, and the boosted gear was glowing faintly on his left arm with a dim, uncertain red light, like an ember that hadn't decided whether to catch or die. He sat there until the rain got louder. The Bale clan had wanted something. That was the part he kept turning over in his mind as he finally climbed the stairs and pushed open the door and walked into the main club room where Rias was standing with her back to him, looking out the rain-streaked window at the school courtyard below. She heard him come in. He could tell by the slight change in how she was holding her shoulders, a fractional straightening, a preparation. She'd always been good at that. Composure as armor. Issei, she said, without turning around. I was in the basement, he said. Came to return Aquino's book. A pause. Outside, rain tapped against old glass. How long were you there? Long enough. She turned then, and he looked at her face and tried to find something to anchor to. The Rias who'd pulled him out of death at the beginning of all this. The Rias who called him her cute little servant, and meant it with genuine warmth. The Rias who'd cried in his arms over things she couldn't control. He looked for her, and found someone who'd already made a decision, and was now in the uncomfortable business of defending it. Then you know what was discussed, she said. Some of it. He set the book down on the nearest table with a care that surprised him. Tell me the part one missed. Rias looked at him. The red of her hair was muted in the gray light from the window, and she was the most composed person he had ever hated looking at. The Bale clan has been applying pressure to my family's standing for the last 6 months, she said. Not public pressure. The other kind. The kind that shows up in closed-door conversations and suddenly unavailable political allies and rating game seedings that go wrong in ways that can't be proven. She paused. You know how devil politics works, Issei. I know how it works. Then you understand that I can't fight it frontally. I don't have the leverage. So you gave them something. She didn't flinch. He almost wished she had. I provided Lord Zekram's representative with a set of documents, analytical projections of the boosted gear's potential power ceiling, cross-referenced with synchronization data from the past year. Combat observations. Tactical assessments. He stood very still. In exchange, she continued, the Bale clan's interference with my family's political position will cease. The pressure comes off. My brother's position in the rating game councils becomes more secure. And my peerage, she stopped, and something moved across her face. My peerage is protected by selling information about me, by providing strategically valuable information about me. His voice was quiet. That was the thing that surprised him most, how quiet it was. He'd expected to be loud. He'd expected the rage to be the first thing out. Instead it felt like something in him had gone very still, like a body of water before a storm. Data about my power. My combat patterns. My limitations. Given to the most politically dangerous clan in Devil's society. He looked at her. That's what you did. Rias held his gaze. It was unnecessary. Don't, he said softly. She stopped. Don't say necessary. The word came out of him like he was lifting something heavy. Don't stand there with your composure and your political reasoning and tell me it was necessary. I bled for you, Rias. I've fought things I had no business fighting. I died once before I was even part of any of this, and you brought me back, and I told myself that meant something, that it meant I was part of something real. He stopped. Started again. Was any of it real, or was I always just a resource? That's not what this is. Then what is it? What do you call handing over everything about how I fight, how I develop, how I can be beaten, to the people who would use it to keep me controlled? He took a breath. What do you call that? Strategy, she said, and her voice was quiet and steady, and it cost her something to say it. He could see that, and he hated that he could see it because it would have been easier if she'd just been cold all the way through. I call it strategy, Issei, because I am the heir of the Gremry clan and I have people depending on me, and sometimes strategy means making choices that hurt people I care about. Right. He nodded slowly. So you care about me? Yes. But you still did it? Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. The rain was loud now. Somewhere upstairs, he could hear someone moving, Akino, probably, or Kaneko. The sounds of the life he'd been living, in this building, with these people, built carefully over months of blood and stupid courage and growing up faster than he'd ever expected to. He looked at the book he'd put down on the table. Akino's book. He meant to return it. I'm leaving the peerage, he said. The silence that followed was very long. Issei, I'm not angry enough to say things I'll regret, he said. So I'll just say this, you made a choice, Rias. You chose the clan's political standing over me. I'm not saying that's wrong. You're a devil noble and this is devil politics and I understand how it works. But I'm also allowed to decide what that choice means for me. He straightened. And it means I'm done. He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when she spoke again. Where will you go? He thought about it for exactly 1 second. I don't know yet. He opened the door and walked out into the rain. He was halfway across the school courtyard before he heard the door open behind him, and he turned, some part of him expecting Rias. But it was Asia, small and drenched within seconds, her blonde hair plastered to her face, her green eyes huge with the particular anguish of someone who'd known something was happening and hadn't been brave enough to stop it. Issei-san, she said. He looked at her. She was shaking, and he didn't think it was from the cold. Did you know? He asked. Her face crumpled. Not a collapse. Asia never fully collapsed, she had too much spine for that despite everything the world had done to her. But a slow, terrible compression, like something being squeezed. I heard, she whispered. I heard her talking to someone 2 nights ago. I didn't understand all of it. I thought, she stopped, pressed her hands together in front of her chest, a gesture so habitual and unconscious it broke his heart a little. I thought I must have misunderstood. Because it couldn't be. It was, he said gently. She made a small, wounded sound. I should have told you. I should have, Asia. He stepped toward her through the rain and put his hands on her shoulders, and she looked up at him with water running down her face that may or may not have been entirely rain. This isn't your fault. But I didn't. It's not your fault. He said it firmly, the way you said things to Asia when she was about to start blaming herself for the rotation of the earth. Okay? She pressed her lips together and nodded, not entirely convinced but willing to accept it for now. Behind her, through the lit windows of the Occult Research Club room, he could see a silhouette, Rias, standing at the window, watching. He could see the red of her hair even through the rain and the glass. He dropped his hands from Asia's shoulders and took a step back. Go inside, he told her. You'll get sick. Where are you going? I'll figure it out. He attempted a smile and suspected it came out wrong. I'll be fine. She looked like she wanted to argue and couldn't find the words, which was the most painful kind of silence. He turned and kept walking. He found the shrine by accident. He'd been walking for, he didn't know how long. The rain hadn't let up. He was soaked through in the way that stopped mattering after the first 10 minutes, when you passed the point of caring about wet and entered the territory of simply being wet, as a state of being rather than a problem. He passed through residential streets and a park and the edge of a commercial district that was closed at this hour, neon signs reflected in puddles, the rare late-night cars sending waves of water across the gutters. He ended up at the top of a hill on the edge of Koa's residential sprawl, where the city gave way to the kind of old-growth trees that Japanese cities never quite managed to entirely cut down, the ones that had been there long enough that people started believing they were protected by something. A flight of worn stone steps led up between two lichen-covered pillars, and at the top was a small Shinto shrine, a main hall barely the size of a large room, a few outbuildings, a stone lantern with a candle inside it that was somehow, impossibly, still lit despite the rain. He climbed the steps because there was nowhere else to go. At the top, he found a covered area, an extended roof off the side of the main hall, the kind of space that was technically outdoors but sheltered enough to be dry. He sat down with his back against the wall of the hall and let out a long breath and looked out at the rain coming down in the dark beyond the roof's edge. He was alone. He sat with that for a while. The physical aloneness, no peerage, no club, no building full of people who knew him. And the other kind. He'd had, in the past year, the strange and unexpected and embarrassing experience of feeling genuinely connected to people. Genuinely needed. Genuinely part of something. He'd been a low-ranked pawn with no special talents except stubbornness and an inexplicable ability to refuse to stay down, and somehow that had been enough. Somehow that had been real. Or he thought it was real. He looked down at his left arm. The boosted gear was still glowing, that dim, uncertain ember red it had been since the basement. Not its normal red. Its normal red was vivid, aggressive, the color of something alive and powerful and constantly ready. This was smaller. Quieter. Hey, he said softly. You still there? He waited. In the past year, Ddraig had always answered. Even in his dormant moments, even when he was conserving power or temporarily disinterested, there was always some quality to the silence that indicated presence. A weight, a warmth, the sense of something enormous and ancient holding its breath nearby. You didn't spend a year sharing your soul with a Welsh dragon without learning the texture of its quiet. He waited. The silence was different. He sat forward, suddenly more alert, something cold moving through him that had nothing to do with wet clothes. Ddraig. Nothing. The boosted gear's ember glow flickered. He pressed his right hand over it, instinctively, the way you'd press a hand to a wound. Hey. His voice was lower now. Hey, I need you to say something. Anything. I know you like being dramatic, but this isn't the time for it. Talk to me. The ember went dim, not out. Dim, the smallest possible red light, barely a glow, like the last heat in a coal. But the presence was gone. The weight in the silence, the enormous, ancient, irritable patience that had become, somewhere along the way, something he relied on without having consciously decided to. Gone. He sat back against the wall. The rain was very loud. The lit stone lantern beyond the covered area burned on, inexplicably, its small warm light holding against the dark and the wet. He had no peerage. No club. No dragon. He sat with that for a long time. Eventually, somewhere in the small hours before dawn, he stopped waiting for the silence to change and closed his eyes and let the sound of the rain be the only thing there was, and he breathed. And he did not sleep, and he did not cry, and he did not fall apart. He'd been dead before, technically. He'd been worse off than this. He breathed. When morning came gray and quiet, the rain had stopped, and an old man in shrine priest's robes was standing in the courtyard looking at him with the calm, unsurprised expression of someone who'd seen stranger things than a soaking wet teenager sleeping against his shrine wall. You hungry? The old man asked. Issei thought about it. Yeah, he said. Actually, yeah. The old priest nodded and turned back toward the hall. Come inside then. I've got rice. Issei pushed himself to his feet. His whole body ached. The boosted gear was dim and quiet on his arm. He followed the old man inside. He didn't know, standing in that small warm shrine kitchen with the smell of rice and wood smoke and old incense, that this was where everything would actually begin, not in devil clubs or peerage oaths or the politics of people who moved other people like chess pieces. Not in a dragon's fire or a noble's ambition. Here. With rice and an old man who didn't ask questions, he would learn, eventually, that the shrine had been built on a ley line, a small, quiet one, nothing dramatic, just a thread of natural spiritual energy that had been there since before anyone had kept records. That the stone lantern's candle never went out because of it. That devil magic felt strange and unwelcome on this ground not because it was holy in any aggressive sense, but simply because it was old and had its own opinions. He would learn that Genshiro Saji, the shrine's caretaker, was not an ordinary priest. But those were later lessons. For now, rice. Warmth. One small lit space in the dark. Issei Hayato ate breakfast, and breathed, and began. The rice was plain and slightly overcooked, served in a chipped ceramic bowl with a pair of wooden chopsticks that had been used so many times the lacquer had worn off completely. There was no seasoning, no side dishes. Just rice and a cup of green tea that was slightly too bitter and slightly too hot. It was the best meal Issei had eaten in weeks. He didn't examine why. He just ate, sitting cross-legged on the worn tatami floor of the shrine's back room, listening to the old priest move around in the adjacent kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been living alone long enough to have made peace with it. No radio. No television. Just the sound of the priest's feet on the wooden floor, the occasional clink of ceramics, the distant call of a crow somewhere in the old trees outside. When the bowl was empty, Issei set it down and looked at his hands. They were steady. That surprised him a little. He'd half expected some physical evidence of last night, shaking, maybe, or that hollow trembling that happens sometimes after a bad fight, when the adrenaline finally let go and your body remembered it was just a body. But his hands were still. Just a little cold. The old priest came back and sat down across from him without ceremony, folding himself into a seiza position with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He was older than Issei had first thought, somewhere in his late 60s, maybe 70s, with deep lines in his face and white hair pulled back in a loose knot, and the kind of eyes that had settled into something undemanding a long time ago. Refill? The priest asked, nodding at the teacup. Please, Issei said. The priest poured. Set the kettle down. Looked at Issei with the same calm, unsurprised expression he'd worn in the courtyard. You don't have to tell me anything, the old man said. Okay, Issei said. But you can if you want. Issei wrapped both hands around the teacup and looked at the steam rising off it. He thought about where to start and realized there was no version of where to start that didn't involve explaining devils and sacred gears and a year of his life that would sound, to any normal person, like elaborate fiction. He thought about Rias standing at the window. He thought about the silence in his arm where Ddraig used to be. I'm having a bad week, he said finally. The old priest nodded as if this was a perfectly complete explanation. Those happen. Yeah, you're welcome to stay in the storage shed until you figure out what's next. It's not much. There's a sleeping mat and a blanket and a kerosene heater that works if you kick it twice on the left side. Issei looked up. You don't know me. No, the priest agreed pleasantly. I might be dangerous. The old man looked at him, really looked at him, the kind of look that took in more than the surface. And then the corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. Probably, he said. Most people who end up at shrines in the rain at 3 in the morning are dangerous in one way or another. He reached for his own teacup. I'm Genshiro. The shrine is Takamori. You don't have to give me your name if you don't want to. Issei thought about it. Issei, he said. Genshiro nodded. Well, Issei. Eat, rest, figure out what's next. The shrine doesn't ask anything of you except that you don't break anything, and you don't bring anything here that doesn't belong. That last part was said with enough quiet precision that Issei understood it wasn't about physical objects. He looked down at the boosted gear, dim, barely visible in the morning light, more like a scar than a weapon. I'll try, he said honestly. The storage shed was exactly what Genshiro had described, small, slightly dusty, smelling of wood and old paper and the faint mineral smell of stone that had been in contact with earth for a very long time. The sleeping mat was thin but serviceable. The kerosene heater required exactly 2 kicks on the left side and then coughed to orange glowing life. There was one small window that looked out into the trees. Issei lay on the sleeping mat and stared at the low ceiling and listened to the shrine wake up around him. Birds in the trees, wind through old wood, somewhere distant the sound of traffic from the city below. The sounds of the world continuing without particularly caring about anything that had happened last night. He didn't sleep. He wasn't ready to sleep yet. Instead, he did what he'd been putting off since he walked away from the school. He tried to assess, clearly and honestly, what his actual situation was. He had no shelter beyond the shed Genshiro had offered. He had no money beyond the small amount he kept in his wallet, enough for a few days of food if he was careful, less if he wasn't. He had no change of clothes. He had no phone charger, which meant his phone was going to die in approximately 6 hours. He had no peerage. He had signed no formal contract with Rias. Their arrangement had been the informal devil peerage system, sealed through the evil peace rather than legal documentation. But he'd handed back the peace in everything but physical act, and he had no illusions about the fact that Rias would process it formally within the next 24 hours. Protocol and composure. She'd do it properly. He flexed his left arm. The boosted gear sat inert on his wrist, the red jewel with no light in it. "Ddraig," he said quietly, to the ceiling. He tried this 4 times since last night. Each time the silence was the same, not aggressive, not hostile, not the deliberate silence of someone choosing not to answer. Just empty. The way a room felt empty when you walked into it, and realized the person who lived there was gone. He pressed his right hand over the jewel. He'd had the sacred gear since birth. It had always been there. He hadn't known what it was until the supernatural world exploded into his life, but looking back, he could trace its presence through his whole life in small ways. The fact that he'd always physically recovered from injuries faster than he should have. The fact that in moments of extreme stress, things that were happening to him would sometimes seem to slow down for just a fraction of a second. He'd never connected those things to anything. They were just how he was. Ddraig had been the voice. The power. The partner he hadn't known he was getting when he got the gear. Now the gear was there. He could feel it, a faint structural presence, like the frame of a building, but Ddraig was not. He tried to push power into it the way he normally would, through the verbal activation he'd always used. The familiar words felt strange without Ddraig there to amplify them, like trying to make a phone call and getting dead air. He tried anyway, mentally shaping the activation sequence. Nothing. He exhaled slowly. Okay. So that was where he was. No home, no money, no dragon, no peerage. Just the shell of a sacred gear and whatever was still in his own body. He thought about Rias's face at the window. He thought about Asia in the rain. He thought about the fact that if Bale's people now had detailed tactical assessments of the boosted gear, his combat patterns, his power ceiling, his limitations, then whatever he did next, he was doing it against opponents who already knew his playbook. He looked at the ceiling. Okay, he said aloud, to no one. Okay. He turned over on the sleeping mat, closed his eyes, and made himself breathe evenly until somewhere in the late morning his body made the decision for him and pulled him under. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, it was dark again, and there was a bowl of rice outside the shed door with a cover over it to keep it warm, and beside it a plastic bag with a toothbrush, a small tube of toothpaste, and a folded change of clothes that were slightly too large for him but clean. Issei sat on the shed's threshold, ate the rice, and did not think about the fact that someone had left these things without waking him or asking anything or expecting anything in return. He mostly succeeded. 3 days passed. He established a rhythm because rhythm was what kept him functional when everything else was uncertain. He woke early, before Genshiro began his morning shrine duties. He used the shrine's outdoor facilities, which were Spartan but adequate. He spent the first hour of each morning sitting in the covered area where he'd waited out the rain, doing nothing in particular, not meditating exactly, because he didn't know how to meditate, but breathing deliberately and trying to be quiet in a way he never had much practice at. Then he trained, not with any particular system. He didn't have a system. What he had was a body that was, even without Ddraig's amplification, considerably more durable than an average human's. A year of Devil World combat had done things to his baseline, and an anger that was slowly compressing itself from its initial explosion into something lower, and steadier and more fuel-efficient. He ran. He did bodyweight exercises until his arms gave out, and then he waited for them to recover and did more. He found a fallen log in the trees behind the shrine, and used it for striking practice until his hands bled and then wrapped them and kept going. Genshiro watched sometimes from a distance. Never commented. Never interfered. Just watched with that settled, undemanding expression and then returned to whatever shrine business occupied his days. On the 4th day, Issei tried the boosted gear again. He sat in the covered area in the early morning and placed his right hand over the jewel and tried every variation of activation he knew, verbal, mental. The reaching out that felt like trying to catch something you couldn't see. He tried for an hour, working through every approach methodically, the way Rias had once told him that real power wasn't raw force but educated force. The jewel was cold, not inert the way a normal piece of metal was inert. There was still something there, that structural presence, the frame without the power. Like a fireplace with no fire. But Ddraig was silent, and the activation mechanisms that depended on their partnership produced nothing. He sat back against the wall and looked at the jewel for a long time. There has to be another way, he said quietly. You're still there. The gear is still there. There has to be. There are 47 recorded instances of sacred gear hosts operating in disrupted synchronization states, said a voice beside him. He was on his feet with his hands up in approximately 0 seconds, heart slamming, the training-wired part of his brain already calculating angles and distances before the rational part caught up and identified what his eyes were seeing. A small girl, sitting beside him on the covered area's wooden floor with her knees drawn up to her chest, wearing a plain black dress, with long dark hair and enormous eyes that looked at him with an expression of complete, alien tranquility. Ophis, the dragon god, just sitting there. Like she'd been sitting there for a while and hadn't felt the need to mention it. He stopped. Managed to bring his heart rate down by about 15% through sheer force of will. When did you get here? A while, Ophis said. How did you get here? This place has. He thought about the feeling of the shrine's ground, the way it had a quality that devil-adjacent things seemed to find unwelcoming. This ground is unusual. Yes, Ophis agreed, as if this was interesting but not particularly relevant to her. He sat back down slowly, because there was no version of this interaction in which standing with his hands up was going to accomplish anything. Ophis didn't fight because she was threatened. Ophis fought, occasionally, rarely, because she decided to, and there was no power differential in the world that changed that equation. You said 47 instances, he said, of disrupted synchronization. She was looking at the jewel on his arm with that steady, curious gaze, the gaze of something that experienced time differently from humans and found most things in the world interesting in the way you found insects interesting. Not personally, but genuinely. Most of them are historical. The synchronization was disrupted by external force rather than the host's psychological state, which is your situation. External force, Issei repeated. The Baal sealing magic. Ophis tilted her head slightly. They applied a suppression working to the gear's resonance frequency. They intended to dampen power output by 40% for political management purposes. They miscalculated the interaction with the existing synchronization bond. Something moved through her expression, not quite contempt, but in that direction. Devil nobles often do. What happened to the bond? The working disrupted the communication layer. Ddraig can't push through. She looked at Issei directly, which she didn't always do. He's there. You should know that. He's not gone. He's muffled, like sound on the other side of a wall. Something loosened in Issei's chest that he hadn't fully acknowledged was tight. Can it be fixed? Eventually. The working decays. Devil magic doesn't hold indefinitely on sacred gears. They're older than devil magic and the substrate doesn't accept foreign structures permanently. She looked back at the jewel. Weeks. Months, perhaps. Depending on variables. And until then, you operate the gear without him. She said it with the simplicity of someone identifying an obvious solution that was merely difficult. The gear is not Ddraig. Ddraig occupies the gear. The gear itself has its own nature. It existed before he was sealed in it, and it will exist after. His occupancy shaped it significantly, yes. But the underlying mechanisms are not him. Issei looked at his arm. I've never used it without him, he said. No, Ophis agreed. I don't know how. No. He waited, but she seemed to consider this a complete exchange of information rather than the opening of a conversation, because she returned to looking at the trees with that settled, cosmic calm that meant she was paying attention to things he couldn't perceive. Why are you here? He asked. I'm curious, she said simply. About what? About you. She glanced at him again. You smell like a dragon but carry no dragon. You're human but you were in a devil peerage. You've been abandoned by your peerage and your partner, and you're sitting at a Shinto shrine hitting a log until your hands bleed. She seemed to be cataloging rather than judging. You're an unusual configuration. Glad I'm interesting, Issei said flatly. The corner of Ophis's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something that occupied the same zip code. I don't help people, she said. I want to be clear about that. Okay, I'm only here because I'm curious. Understood. But, she said, looking back at the trees, the 47 historical cases I mentioned. 23 of them eventually re-established synchronization stronger than before. Of the 23, 19 had developed alternative access methods during the disruption period, methods that were later integrated into the restored synchronization, producing what scholars catalogued as enhanced sacred gear operation. She fell silent. Issei looked at her sideways. Is that a hint? It's a historical observation, Ophis said serenely. Right. He looked at the boosted gear. At the cold jewel. At his own hands still rough from 3 days of hitting a log, starting to callous in new places. Alternative access methods, he said quietly. I'm going to sit here for a while, Ophis said. If that's acceptable. Issei thought about the fact that the dragon god was asking his permission to sit in a shrine that wasn't his and decided there was no right way to respond to that. Sure, he said. She nodded and returned to looking at the trees, and Issei looked at his arm, and the crow in the old tree at the edge of the property called once, twice, 3 times, and the morning continued. He found out about the school records on day 6. His phone had died on day 2, but Genshiro had a landline, a rotary phone that looked like it belonged in a museum, and on day 6 Issei used it to call Motohama, which was the choice he made when he needed information without having to explain anything to anyone who'd ask real questions. Motohama, who had known Issei for years and possessed the particular brand of loyalty that annoyed people maintained for each other through social proximity, picked up on the 3rd ring. Hey, Issei said. A pause. Hayadu? We thought you were dead. Or transferred. Your desk got cleared out. What? Day before yesterday. Someone came from the administration and packed up your stuff and said you transferred. They had paperwork. Another pause. Issei, what the hell is going on? Matsuda's been trying to reach you. Your club friends. Motohama's voice shifted slightly, taking on the quality of someone choosing words carefully. Your club friends have been weirdly quiet. The scary one with the silver hair looked like she was going to bite someone's head off in the hallway this morning. But that might be normal. Kaneko, Issei thought. Looking for a fight because she couldn't do anything else. I transferred, Issei said. Sort of. It's complicated. Complicated like you're okay complicated, or complicated like I should be worried? First one. Mostly. He paused. Motohama, if anyone asks where I am, I don't know where you are, Motohama said immediately. I haven't talked to you. This conversation isn't happening. Despite everything, Issei felt something warm move through him. Motohama was annoying and voyeuristic and had spent the better part of 3 years being the worst wingman in recorded history, but when it mattered, he was solid. Thanks, Issei said. Don't die, Motohama said, and hung up. Issei set the phone down and stood in the shrine's main hallway for a moment, looking at the pale rectangle of the window at the far end with afternoon light coming through it. They'd erased him from the school records. He understood the politics of it. If Issei Hayadu was officially no longer at Ko Academy, then questions about where he was became administrative questions rather than personal ones. If Bale's people wanted to locate him, they'd have to do it through supernatural means rather than bureaucratic ones, which was simultaneously harder and more dangerous. He understood the logic. He also understood that it meant Rias, or someone acting for her, had made the decision to erase him from his own life for the sake of clean management. He went back to the storage shed and changed into training clothes. The ones Genshiro had left him were wearing in now, and went out to the log in the trees and hid it until the light was gone. On day 8 he had his first real breakthrough with the gear. He'd been following Ophis's historical observation like a map with no territory. He knew the destination existed but had no specific instructions for reaching it. He'd been trying things, sitting with the gear and trying to feel it rather than use it. Pressing his awareness into it the way you press the finger into dough slowly, to see what was there. What was there, he was gradually discovering, was not nothing. The gear had texture. That was the only word he had for it. When Ddraig was present and active, The texture was overwhelmed by his presence the way a room was overwhelmed by a fire. All you noticed was the fire. But with Ddraig muffled and the fire banked, Issei was starting to notice the room itself. Old. The gear was old in a way that made him dizzy when he pressed too far into it. He'd known, intellectually, that sacred gears were ancient. Rias had given him the historical rundown early on. But knowing it and feeling it were different. The gear felt like standing at the edge of something with no bottom, looking down. It had held others before him. That was the other thing he was starting to sense, not clearly, not with any details, just the faint impression of previous occupancy. Echoes. The way a well-used chair held the shape of people who'd sat in it before. On day 8, he was sitting in the pre-dawn dark of the shed, back against the wall, gear hand resting on his knee, doing his deliberate breathing because Genshiro had shown him, without naming it as anything, a particular way of breathing that made the quiet underneath the quiet easier to access. When something happened, the jewel pulsed, once. A single heartbeat of red light. No sound. No warmth. Just light there and gone, like a blink. Issei opened his eyes and looked at it. He pressed his awareness back in, carefully, the way you move through a dark room, feeling ahead of yourself. The texture of the gear. The depth of it. The echoes of previous hosts. He pushed further than he had before, past the point where the dizziness started, past the point where he usually pulled back, and heard something, not a voice. Not language. More like resonance. A frequency that resolved, the longer he listened, into something like memory. An impression of movement, combat specifically, but not his movement, not his memory, not his body. A different body. A different time. Someone who'd fought like this before. Without a partner. Without a voice. Just the gear and the will and the body. He reached for it without thinking, the way you reached for something in a dream before you woke up. The jewel pulsed again. Held this time. A sustained, low red light that was different from normal activation, softer, steadier, less aggressive. Like a coal rather than a flame. His left arm felt warm. He stood up slowly, not wanting to break whatever he'd found, and made a fist and pushed. The warmth spread up his arm. Not the explosive doubling he was used to. Something smaller. But real. Undeniably real. Power moving through the gear into him, quiet and steady. With no verbal command, no partner, no call and response. Just him, and the gear, and whatever the gear held in its oldest places. He stood in the dark shed with the low red light washing over him and felt, for the first time in 8 days, like something other than a person waiting to fall. The light held for 37 seconds before it guttered out. He sat down and pressed his back against the wall and looked at his arm, the jewel dark again, and breathed. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. There you are. Somewhere outside, in the old trees, a crow called in the pre-dawn dark. Issei closed his eyes and memorized the feeling, the particular quality of attention, the depth of the breathing, the specific place below conscious effort where the gear's old texture had answered him. He started again. Genshiro found him still at it 2 hours later when the old priest came to open the shrine for the morning. He looked at Issei, sitting cross-legged with his back against the storage shed's outer wall, arm resting on his knee, the jewel pulsing that soft low light at irregular intervals, face absolutely concentrated, and said nothing. Simply went about his morning preparation. Swept the courtyard. Lit the offerings. Made his prayers. When Issei finally stopped, hands dropping to his sides, the quiet concentration breaking into the visible tiredness of someone who'd done real work, Genshiro brought him tea without being asked. Whatever you're practicing, the old priest said, you should practice it on the ground, not the wall. Your spine is compensating. Issei blinked. What? Your breathing technique. Genshiro sat down on the swept stones with the ease of long practice. You've learned something right, but your body mechanics are fighting it. You need ground contact, floor or earth. He demonstrated a slight adjustment in posture, barely anything, just the angle of the spine and where the weight settled. Here, Issei mirrored the adjustment. It did feel different. How do you know anything about? He stopped. Genshiro's expression had that quality again. The one that held more than it showed. Takamori Shrine has been here for 1100 years, the old priest said mildly. It sits on ground that doesn't belong to any particular tradition or faction. He looked at Issei's arm without obvious reaction. We've hosted a great many unusual young people who needed a quiet place to figure out what was next. He stood. Rias in 20 minutes. He walked back toward the main hall. Issei watched him go, then looked at the gear, then looked at the morning sky above the old trees, clear today, pale blue with high thin clouds, and thought about 1100 years, and unusual young people, and ground that didn't belong to any particular tradition. He settled his spine the way Genshiro had shown him. Placed his arm on his knee. Breathed into the quiet below the quiet. The jewel pulsed. He stayed with it. On day 11, Ophis appeared again, this time sitting on the roof of the storage shed, which was technically impossible for several structural reasons but which she appeared to find comfortable. 3 of the 47 historical cases, she said, without preamble, developed their alternative access methods within the first 2 weeks. Issei was on the ground, post-training, looking at the sky, too tired to be startled by her anymore. And the others? Months. Years. A pause. One took a decade. Great. You're doing well, she said, which was so out of character for anything he'd ever heard from Ophis that he sat up and looked at her. She was looking at the treeline, not at him. You said you don't help people, he said. I said I'm curious, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He lay back down and looked at the sky again. Somewhere in the devil world, somewhere in Koa's carefully maintained supernatural underlay, things were happening that he couldn't see from here. Rias was managing the political aftermath. Baal's people were somewhere doing whatever Baal's people did. Asia was presumably trying to navigate the occult research club without saying what she knew and probably making herself miserable in the attempt. And he was here, on the ground, at a shrine that was 1100 years old, learning to breathe through a sacred gear that held the memories of people who'd fought alone. It wasn't nothing. It wasn't what he'd had, or what he thought he'd had, or what he'd been building toward with people he'd trusted. But it wasn't nothing. Hey, he said to the shed roof. Said Ophis. Thanks. For the historical observation. A long silence. It was information, Ophis said. Not help. Right, Issei agreed. Not help. Above him, the sky held that particular clarity that only came in the early days of a change in season, sharp and pale and full of something that hadn't arrived yet. He lay on the ground of a shrine that sat on a ley line that was 1100 years old, and breathed, and the gear pulsed once in his arm like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. He had work to do. The dreams started on night 12, not nightmares. That was the first thing Issei registered when he woke from the first one, sitting upright on the thin sleeping mat, breathing hard, the kerosene heater ticking in the corner. Not nightmares, because nightmares left you cold and wanting distance from whatever you'd just seen. These left him leaning toward the dark, wanting to go back, the way you wanted to go back to a sentence in a book you'd read too fast. He laid down and stared at the shed ceiling and tried to hold what he'd seen. A battlefield. Old, not ancient in the mythological sense, but old in the specific, grounded way of somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years ago. The kind of old you could date by the armor and the weapons and the particular quality of chaos that existed before firearms changed the nature of war. Rolling terrain. A valley and a hill and a sky the bruised color of a late autumn dusk. A man fighting alone on the hill. Not young, middle-aged probably, though it was hard to tell with the face half hidden beneath a war helmet, and not fighting with any particular elegance. What he was doing was closer to engineering than art. Deliberate weight distribution. Economy of movement. Each strike placed rather than swung, and on his left arm, familiar as his own heartbeat, the same red jewel, darker in color than Issei's, more crimson than scarlet, but the same structure, the same weight in the air around it, glowing without a word being spoken, pulsing in that same low, steady way Issei had found in the pre-dawn dark of the shed, the coal rather than the flame. The alternative access method. The man on the hill fought 6 opponents in sequence, none of whom appeared to understand what they were dealing with, and when the last one was down he stood on the crest of the hill in the failing light, and looked at his arm and said something that Issei couldn't hear. The dream had sound but not language, or the language was too far from anything Issei knew, and then looked up at the sky with an expression Issei recognized. The expression of someone who was alone in a way they hadn't expected to be, and was deciding, in real time, what that meant for what they did next. Issei woke from that and lay on the mat, and the heater ticked, and outside the trees moved in the night wind. Host, he said quietly, to the ceiling, to the gear, to whatever the gear held. Show me more. The jewel pulsed once on his arm. He closed his eyes and waited. By the fourth dream, he'd started keeping a notebook. Genshiro had produced one without being asked. A plain composition book with a marbled cover, the kind sold at any convenience store, and left it outside the shed with a pen. In the same manner he produced everything, without announcement or expectation, simply present when needed. Issei wrote in it every morning after the dreams, while the details were still clear. Not narrative. He wasn't writing a story, he was recording observations the way he'd been taught to record anything that might matter later. Bullet points. Diagrams where words weren't enough. Technical breakdowns of what he was seeing. Dream 3, the stance. Weight back, not forward. Everything he'd been taught about aggressive combat posture said forward. Weight on the front foot, momentum channeled into attacks. The feudal host did the opposite. Weight settled back and low, centered, the way a stone wall was centered, not aggressive, just completely immovable. The gear's power, in this configuration, didn't push outward. It reinforced inward. Density rather than force. Dream 4, the breathing cycle. Genshiro's adjustments, applied to combat. Not meditation breathing. The rhythm was different, shorter, calibrated to movement. The host breathed in on guard, out on strike, and the gear's pulse synchronized to the breath cycle without any conscious management. Issei had been trying to consciously direct the access method, treating it like a tool he wielded. The host treated it like a heartbeat, something that ran beneath conscious attention because it was built into the rhythm of being alive. Dream 5, the loss. This one was harder to write. The host had not always been alone. There had been someone. Issei couldn't get clear details from the dream's limited vantage, but the implication was in the way the man moved, the particular quality of his situational awareness, the habit of leaving space on his left side as if expecting someone to fill it who no longer did. A partner of some kind, a companion who fought alongside him who was gone. The boosted gear, in the dreams, was different when the partner was absent. Not weaker, Issei was careful to note this accurately, but different in character. The power that came through was rawer, less refined, more direct. When Ddraig was present and active, the gear's output was shaped by his dragon nature, fire and aura and the specifically draconic quality of overwhelming force. Without Ddraig shaping it, the power that came through the host in the dreams was neutral. Pure amplification with no native flavor. It could be shaped by the host rather than by the occupant. Issei stared at that note for a long time. Could be shaped by the host. He wrote it again, underlined. You're dreaming about previous hosts, Genshiro said. They were eating breakfast. Morning 12 of the new rhythm. Issei had started joining Genshiro for meals in the shrine's small kitchen rather than eating alone in the shed. Partly for the company and partly because the old priest had started using mealtimes to teach things without appearing to teach things. And Issei was not going to miss that. He looked up. How do you know that? Genshiro was looking at the composition book, which Issei had left on the table without thinking. The cover gave away nothing, but the old priest seemed to understand anyway. The sacred gears that have long lineages sometimes do this, Genshiro said, with the tone of someone discussing weather patterns. Informational, not alarmed. When the primary occupant is unavailable, the gear reaches back into its own history. Gives the host something to work with. He poured more tea. It's not common knowledge. Most people who encounter sacred gears encounter them through devil or angel scholarship, which tends to focus on the occupant rather than the vessel. Issei watched him pour. You know a lot about sacred gears for a shrine priest. Takamori has hosted many unusual young people, Genshiro repeated, with that same mild deflection. He set the kettle down. How are the burns? Issei looked at his forearm. The attempts to access the gear's power, the failed ones, which were still the majority, produced a feedback burn where the energy discharged improperly, leaving marks on his skin that healed within hours but were unpleasant during. He'd been covering them. He didn't remember Genshiro seeing them. Fine, he said. They heal. They'll stop happening when you stop forcing it, Genshiro said. You're still treating it like a mechanism. Something you operate. He picked up his chopsticks. You operate tools. You breathe air. Which is this? Issei thought about the feudal host's breathing cycle. The heartbeat rhythm. Breathing, he said. Genshiro nodded once, satisfied, and returned to his rice. Issei looked at his arm and tried to stop holding his breath. Day 15. He was in the trees behind the shrine, working through a solo drill. No equipment, just movement, running through the attack sequences Vali had once shown him with contemptuous efficiency. The ones Issei had been too outclassed at the time to fully absorb but had memorized anyway because his body retained things his brain was still catching up to, when he felt it. Not the force pulse of his active attempts. The natural kind. The heartbeat. He stopped mid-movement, arm coming up without thinking, and the jewel was glowing, that low crimson coal light, without him having done anything deliberate to start it. He'd been moving, breathing in the combat rhythm he'd been building, half from Genshiro's instruction and half from the dreams. The rhythm had simply synced. He held very still. The light held. He completed the movement he'd stopped midway. Slowly, carefully, tracking the breath. In on guard. Out on strike. The weight back and low, the way the host's stance settled. The light held. He completed the sequence. Then another. The light fluctuated with the effort, brighter on the strike, steadier on the guard. But it didn't go out. It tracked his movement like it was learning the rhythm, or like the rhythm was waking something up that had been waiting to be woken. He felt stronger. Not explosively doubled the way Ddraig's active boosts had felt, not the volcanic surge of power that had made him capable of things his body physically shouldn't have been able to do. This was quieter. A 20% increase, maybe 30. Consistent rather than spiked. Built into the baseline rather than stacked on top of it. He kept moving. The trees received it without comment. The crow in its usual branch regarded him with the professional skepticism of something that had watched a great many human beings do strange things in these particular trees. He moved through 6 more sequences before the light faded, naturally, like a breath releasing. He stood in the dappled morning light and breathed. His arms were not burned. He sat down on a tree root and looked at the gear with something complicated. Not triumph, exactly, not the aggressive satisfaction of winning a fight. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a thing that had been broken beginning, very slowly and very imperfectly, to find a new shape. Okay, he said softly. Okay. That's something. He opened the composition book to a new page and wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. He didn't expect visitors. This was perhaps naive. In retrospect, he'd been at the shrine for 17 days. He'd been training visibly enough that the energy signature of the gear, even at its reduced output, was probably legible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. And the devil world was, at its core, a world of people who looked for things. He was doing his evening practice. The breath rhythm sequences in the covered area, the soft red light of the coaxes method steady on his arm, when the feeling came. The particular atmospheric shift that preceded a devil's deliberate arrival. Pressure, slight and directional, like a change in weather. He was on his feet and turned before the arrival completed. Vala Lucifer stepped out of a transfer circle that dissolved behind him like smoke in wind. He was exactly as Issei remembered, white hair, gray eyes, the particular quality of someone who had assessed every room he'd ever walked into and found it insufficiently challenging. He was wearing street clothes rather than his usual combat gear, which was either a de-escalation signal or an arrogance signal. With Vala, these were sometimes the same thing. He looked at Issei. At the faint glow of the gear. At the composition book on the floor. At the shed, the covered area, the old shrine building with its worn wood and its inexhaustible candle. Interesting choice of location, he said. I didn't choose it, Issei said. It chose